President, please.
I need a little water, too, in the morning. Anyway, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. Welcome to CyCon. As Sven nicely said, my last one. And he's actually quite happy about that. Thank God he's leaving. Anyway, it's good to see you all here. Dealing with one of, I think, the most important topics in security. When we speak of power in military and security terms in the digital world, we invariably recognize that this world itself began in the military research domain. Be it Alan Turing during the Second World War, working on decrypting Enigma, or the origins of the web in DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, we recognize that, like with so many technological innovations, the digital world originated actually in the defense establishment. Then again, so what? For it would be a mistake to confuse etiology with contemporary use, just as the fact that we know that NASA sponsored the development of Velcro. You don't really think about it every time you put on your running shoes. So, yes, it does come out of the military, but it has permeated virtually all aspects of our lives. For while we here all know that the digital world is increasingly a battlefield where state and non-state actors, nations, criminals, and terrorists, sometimes in collusion or in novel public-private partnerships, as is often the case with mafia-run botnets rendering themselves to nation-states. It's an explosive development, is a result of the explosive development of the web, and for military espionage and extortion ends. But in many ways, the defense establishment has become the tail of the dog, because in fact, most of the time targets are not military. Although everything we call cyber began with military research, the military side does not occupy the minds of those millions of people involved in all things digital, except at conferences like these. Indeed, the military, as opposed to the criminal side of cyber, wasn't taken seriously at all as late as 9 years ago, when Estonia was subjected to what is considered the first Clausewitzian continuation of policy by digital means. Indeed, if you go a mile down the road today to our major annual startup conference, Latitude 59, you'll find plenty of young innovators working on Internet of Things, smart health, and so on, whose thoughts are far removed from the military and defense matters that are discussed at this conference. Not that digital means, when I think of the Clausewitzian developments here, had not been used before 2007 to achieve military or political ends, but the 2007 massive DDoS attacks on Estonia are considered the first case of an attack by one country against another. Back then, though, we were told not even to think of invoking Article 4, let alone 5, of the North Atlantic Treaty. And as Sven mentioned, 9 years later, on the eve of the Warsaw Summit, just as an example of how much attitudes have changed, we anticipate, meaning we're not sure, but it's kind of leaning in that direction, that cyber will be named as the fifth domain of warfare after land, air, sea, and space, which shows how much thinking has changed in less than a decade. Of course, on the other hand, is cyber a domain? Because what we call cyber, given the massive use of digital system actually permeates virtually everything, be it land, air, sea, and of course, space. While I can't but welcome this development and this understanding that digital means can be just as effective militarily as kinetic means, or more bluntly, that some lines of code can just as effectively knock out a power plant as a missile, I nonetheless believe that we are putting the cart, or those of you who are military, putting the caisson before the horse. That I think only works for American military. But anyway, if we look at defense, to talk about why it is the caisson before the horse, if we look at defense, this is a national prerogative. Cyber defense, even more so, is a national prerogative. For while allies strive for the interoperability of kinetic weapon systems so that a British missile should be mountable under the wing of a French Mirage jet, for example, cyber defense has no such requirements. And as I've lamented on this, for years actually, on this stage, when it comes to cyber, we find ourselves rather in intelligence agency mode, where we share as little as possible and only when necessary. Not that NATO does not share, but not in ways outsiders think. NATO's Cooperative Center of Excellence for Cyber Defense, as Sven mentioned, and which he leads, headquartered here in Tallinn, focuses on research and development of technology and concepts and in legal issues. NATO's NCIRC only works on NATO's own cyber defense, that is defending the organization's own networks. It's kind of like the military police. They don't go around worrying about street crime. They worry about what goes on within the military. So there is no joint NATO cyber capability, still no NATO cyber operations. NATO's main cyber efforts, however, remain focused on military defense of the organization itself, while recognizing the importance of civilian networks and the risks that they face. NATO lacks the legal or policy levers to address these questions directly. At the supranational level also, the European Union has begun to deal with cybersecurity, supplementing or superseding member state policies in a number of areas, including those related to economic justice and home affairs. While national governments guard their sovereignty in the areas of defense and foreign policy, the EU maintains some limited authority in these areas. In fact, the EU is developing a considerable role in shaping the European cybersecurity landscape, primarily through legislation and expenditures related to economic regulation, individual rights, and internal security. Some progress is being made on threats that are supernatural. Supernatural is going to be the sixth domain, but let us think through what it is that we are talking about when we talk about keeping our networks and systems safe. Which systems? We worry first and foremost about civilian and commercial networks. We worry about power grids and traffic control systems, hospitals. We worry about banks and financial markets, credit cards, personal data records. All of these have come under attack. Serious or large-scale damage to these in the digital age can, in fact, have disastrous consequences for our populations and our economies. And I would argue that national defense, which is a national prerogative, I repeat, is something which has been traditionally designed to prevent those things. But then again, these kinds of disastrous effect don't fall under the purview of national defense institutions. In addition to what I mentioned, we also have IoT, machines talking to machines, chips talking to chips. The worries of the broader public, which focus on such issues as privacy, pale, indeed are minuscule, compared to the damage that can be wrought with attacks on data integrity, an issue that all of us need to explain better than we have. I would say, as in a personal side, I constantly have to deal with people, legislators, politicians, who worry first and foremost about privacy, which is a legitimate concern. But I say, but folks, data integrity is a lot worse. And most of them have never even heard of data integrity, so I explain it simply as, I may not like it if someone knows my blood type, but if in the records my blood type is changed, that's data integrity, that's a lot worse. So maybe you can take from the speech at least that one little thing to convince our policymakers that more attention needs to be paid to data integrity. And as I said, we do need to explain this not only to publics that are worried about the bad NSA coming and reading the mails of bohemian poets to their girlfriends, which they're not doing, and worry a lot more about data integrity. But you people here know all of this, and there's no need for me to repeat it. What I would like to draw your attention to, though, is that almost all of the systems, these systems whose security worry about are in fact commercial products, both software and hardware. Companies, banks, municipal SCADA systems, IoT-based cars, refrigerators, manufacturing processes are all vulnerable, and the more modern, the more digitized, the less legacy-based the system, the more vulnerable. And they're all using commercial software, commercial hardware. In other words, we are concerned about commercial software and hardware produced by multinational or international companies. The same Microsoft or SAP or Oracle software, and Intel, Alcatel, HP, or Huawei hardware is used the world over. So through the years, especially in this forum, I've asked the question of whether the Westphalian state system can still work in a digital 21st century. Historically, as I started saying in the beginning, our security has been implemented and guaranteed by national territorial units, also known as states. Today, however, in the digital world, the digital domain, the most fundamental aspects of our security represent an intimate and inextricable intertwining of the state and the private sector. And the private sector has a different set of concerns. With commercial products, security considerations are driven by the bottom line. And these companies may be headquartered in Palo Alto, Beijing, Waldorf, but their customers span the globe. So they may care about security, but they need to care about the security of their customers across the world. So it would be unsurprising to see situations where companies and governments pursuing the same aims ultimately disagree about how to achieve security. Witness the showdown between Apple and the FBI over unlocking an encrypted iPhone. Two actors opposed to one another, but ultimately committed to security, but with very different visions of how to get there. Usually, I end up talking about, when we talk about this topic, end up talking about PPP, public-private partnerships, governments working together with the private sector. Yet, as I mentioned, the private sector is multinational and international. Privacy, integrity, and security concerns are historically strictly national. How do we square this circle? This is a problem that we haven't solved, and I would say we will need to do that. So far, when we have seen conflicts between IT companies and states, they have been primarily about taxation or extraterritoriality of jurisdiction, as with the US government's purview over data and servers abroad, or in pursuing cyber criminals. But that's really the extent of it. It is a truism, ladies and gentlemen, that in the world of cyber, geography ceases to play a role. All distances are equal. Unlike conventional warfare, there is, in the case of cyber, an equality of threat regardless of distance. All the more so when we overwhelmingly use software and hardware sold and used around the world. With hard and software used around the world and territorially based states responsible for the security of systems used in those states, we clearly have a problem with suggestions for closer cooperation between the government and the private sector. Unless, of course, states get together to work with the private sector. And this to solve those thorny and jurisdictional issues, to look at the security of supply chains and so forth, or to issue warnings when one country discovers a zero-day exploit or a new worm and so forth. Clearly, this is difficult, especially when we consider authoritarian and undemocratic regimes. NATO, as a group of like-minded and basically value-based nations, could serve this function, but so far hasn't. Locked, as I mentioned, in the espionage rather than interoperability mode. Moreover, it is geographically based, not really useful in the instantaneous, borderless digital world. Where would, in the case of cybersecurity, where we'd have NATO, where would that leave other liberal democratic rule-based societies such as Australia, Japan, South Korea, or even local non-members of NATO, such as local meaning in the neighborhood, members such as Finland, Sweden, and Austria. As the threats that we face in this digital world, why no geography, so why should defense recognize geography? So, thinking about these things, I figure about the closest, and I'm not saying this is a good idea, but just as the kind of thinking we should be developing, I think in the long run, is something like John McCain's, or before that, Madeleine Albright's Community of Democracies. Ideas that were floated in the late 90s and first decade of this century, but without any operational component. It was just this kind of nice idea first from Madeleine Albright, Secretary of State in the Clinton administration, that we shouldn't only have NATO, or we should have other democratic countries and bring them together. John McCain suggested the same thing a few years later. And that is, we would have something that wouldn't be NATO, but democracies, I underline democracies, that are concerned about digital security. A club of rule of law-based democratic countries that also certify software and hardware, where membership is a privilege that also carries benefits to those who join, but also carry the responsibility of keeping fellow members of the club informed about what members are saying. I rush to say this is decidedly not a grouping like the conventions proposed in various forms, often by undemocratic and authoritarian countries, that involve inter alia replacing ICANN with the ITU, or with treaties that would limit freedom of expression, indeed even allow for censorship on the World Wide Web. It is not that. I would say, since I did chair the ICANN Reform Committee, I can say there are a lot of people who would like to see the web regulated, and the people who want to regulate them have a pretty poor track record on human rights. That is not what I mean. Because, this is why have always been very dubious about any kind of regulation of the web, but I think a voluntary association that would be of use to the liberal democratic world. The democratic and rule of law nature of a country, how democratic and how how well rule of law functions, how well human rights are respected, would be the primary consideration for membership, kind of like the Copenhagen criteria that needed to be fulfilled for countries even to begin to be considered for European Union accession. Except we would leave out the geographic dimension of this. The Copenhagen criteria apply to all countries that are geographically on the continent of Europe, however we define that. And we say, well, if you fulfill these criteria, then you can join the European Union. Well, I would say we get rid of the geographic element and say, all of you guys who respect the fundamental rules of liberal democracy may join this security, digital security organization, and no matter where you are. But if you don't fulfill those requirements, well, then too bad. One sort of more or less overlapping constellation already exists, the Budapest Convention, which was originally, as some of you know, the Council of Europe Convention on Cybercrime, where signatories obligate themselves to extradite cyber criminals. It was originally the Council of Europe, but then other countries that are not in Europe, United States, Japan, they all said, wow, this is a pretty good idea. We'll also accede to this, so it is now renamed the Budapest Convention because, for the same reasons as I mentioned before, that geography does not play a role in cybercrime. We also don't need to recall, but I will, that the primary sources of cybercrime have been traditionally countries that have refused to accede to the convention. We know who they are. Getting this right, of course, that is getting some kind of broader security cooperation, will be difficult and indeed could be considered utopian. I am not naive. With a quarter century in foreign policy negotiating inter alia Estonia's EU and NATO accession and any number of other agreements, I know full well how difficult it would be to bring together nations to do this. My last page is falling off here, but anyway, what the hell. I can wing it. So I would leave you with this, that we have to try. We have to do something. The current situation, I mean, we've managed to get through till now without the kind of international cooperation on cybersecurity. But this fundamental, well, not conflict, but this contradiction between multinational companies, multinational software, everyone uses the same SAP or Microsoft or whichever software, regardless of country. And then the fact all of us deal with cybersecurity in our own countries and don't really talk to the other guys means that there will inevitably be a conflict. The international nature of the software world, for example, is best shown by the use of lack of certification of Microsoft software in NGOs in Russia being the cause for shutting down the NGOs because their software had been pirated. I mean, it's a pretty odd form of repression, but it worked and it was used. Finally, ultimately, Microsoft said, no, we forgive those NGOs that are being shut down because they have pirated the software. But nonetheless, software is everywhere. The same hardware is everywhere. Moreover, some of the same hardware is penetrated the same way. There's a wonderful piece just yesterday in Wired about how there are some companies that, or some hardware products that from day one have greater vulnerabilities than they should have. You can check it out, look up Wired, there it is. So in this world of great insecurity, the good guys, liberal democratic societies that believe in freedom of speech, rule of law, all of that stuff that makes us what we are, better get together because otherwise we'll be facing some real messes. I thank you. I wish you all a wonderful conference. And see you next year, but with a different name and title.
Well, Mr. President, the rumor has it that from, I think, 11th of October, you might have a bit more free time at your hand than last 10 years. One thing what we recommend is to take up gardening. This is a wonderful creation. You can see it in that corner. It's called Click and Grow. You basically add water and electricity and click, and it grows. Of course, it has its own app. You can name the plants and so forth. Mr. President, thank you very much for supporting CyCon this year and all the previous years. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sven. As a commercial break, I say this is indeed an Estonian company. Used to be a startup, now it's a worldwide, it's no longer a startup, but it's not yet a unicorn. I would also point out that the general tradition of former presidents is to take up painting bad paintings.
Yeah, right.